afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to be here with you. I know afternoon sessions are not so easy. First of all, before I begin, I would like to really extend my heartfelt thanks to the organizers of this wonderful conference. Many of us may not know what goes behind organizing such an event, but trust me, it's a lot of time and hours and activities and anxieties. And finally, this beautiful product takes shape. And so I'm really grateful to all of the organizers for bringing us all together at this beautiful conference on the theme of spirituality and the culture of peace. And to everyone attending this conference, thank you for joining this urgent and vital conversation. It's one that affects every one of us deeply because the forces of prejudice in all of their forms still divide our communities, damage lives, and erode our shared humanity. Together, we are here to ask, how can we eliminate these forces and replace them with a culture of peace? One that is grounded in spiritual values, moral values, and lived out every day through our actions. Because unless we root out prejudice at its core, it will continue to tear our world apart. Building a peaceful and just world requires more than just opposing prejudice. We have to dig deeper to understand and eliminate the root causes that keep it alive. In my work at the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, we have deeply focused on this big, challenging question. How do we truly eliminate all the forms of prejudices that really impact this world in a negative way? Prejudices such as nationalism, politics, economics, or economic inequalities, religious prejudice, class, and of course, gender. And more specifically, how do we confront and eradicate racial prejudice at its root? I hope by the end of this presentation, we will walk away with some meaningful insights along with solutions and actions that each of us can engage in to help eradicate prejudice, and especially, as I said, racial prejudice. After all, it is impossible to imagine a world free of prejudice. We will never be able to build one. And the possibility of a better and more peaceful world will remain out of our reach, because Abdu'l-Baha has stated, peace must first be established among individuals until it leads in the end to peace among the nations. Extremely important. Peace must first be established among individuals until it leads in the end to peace among the nations. So every one of us can help to establish a culture of peace. It starts with each of us. We must never assume that eliminating prejudice and pursuing peace are beyond our reach as individuals. In fact, I would suggest, and there is strong evidence to support this, that because each of us possesses agency, because each of us has initiative, free will, that we each bear a responsibility to build the kinds of relationships and models that foster harmony and peace, beginning in our families, extending to our neighborhoods and workplaces, and radiating out into the society at large. Before we explore what prejudice really means, let me share a story that powerfully illustrates how easily our minds can fall into prejudiced patterns of thinking, especially regarding racial prejudice. There's a beautiful idea in a book which you may have read or at least heard of called The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb. He explains that one of the most dangerous forms of prejudice is the belief that we know more than we actually do. This is one of the most dangerous forms of prejudice, that we know more than we really know. He gives the example of a turkey, and I illustrated by a very cute turkey, who is fed every day by a very kind farmer, tended to beautifully by the farmer, and the turkey becomes more and more sure that the farmer loves him. He's extremely comfortable in that environment until the day before Thanksgiving, when everything changes for the poor turkey. I give you this story because it illustrates the mistake of assuming the future would always be like the past. That's a kind of mental prejudice, assuming that we already understand how the world works and ignoring anything that doesn't fit into our picture. The author of the book says that the biggest event in history, like wars, financial crises, or even major scientific discoveries, are often things no one predicted. But when we are too sure of ourselves, when we only listen to people who think like us, we can't see those events coming. This kind of narrow thinking can be just as harmful as other forms of prejudice. It shuts out different voices, makes society less flexible, and causes real damage when things go wrong. Racial prejudice fits into this pattern. It simplifies and distorts entire groups of people based on stereotypes, ignoring the vast individuality and richness of every human being's life. Like all dangerous prejudices, it blinds us to truth and prepares the ground for systemic injustice. Fighting prejudice is not just about treating people equally, as important as that is. It's about, first, cultivating humility. Cultivating humility. The capacity to admit that I may not know enough, that I may not understand enough, that who am I to make assumptions? Who am I to promote stereotypes? So it begins, to eliminate prejudice begins with humility. But then it requires open-mindedness. Open-mindedness and the awareness that the world is far, far more complex than we often assume. So let me now briefly define what I mean by prejudice. And what is the definition of prejudice? Prejudice is, first and foremost, an irrational and often unconscious attitude or a judgment towards an individual or a group, usually rooted in stereotypes rather than facts or personal experiences. For example, we are gathered here, most of us, I would assume, from an Iranian background. I am sure you have heard prejudices and stereotypes that have been expressed about this culture, the Iranian people. Stereotypes such as, all Iranian women are good cooks. I'll start with that one. Not true. Not true. And I will wager, although I can't bet, but I would take you up on this one, that it's just simply not true. But there's a stereotype, there is a prejudice already, a prejudgment. And there are many others, I don't want to list them, they're usually very negative and not helpful. But prejudice is a preconceived negative opinion or attitude. In other words, before you even know the facts, before you even have knowledge about a situation, you've already made up your mind, just like the poor turkey. And our prejudice is often based on inadequate and information that is actually inaccurate. And here I want to just take a few minutes to say that social media and images on a TV screen are the most dangerous forms of information that promotes prejudice. Every time you watch a news on one of these cable channels, you repeatedly see images, especially of certain groups, that promote prejudice after prejudice after prejudice, never stopping to assume that this may not be accurate, this may not be really true. Prejudice involves making assumptions about people based on characteristics like skin color, like gender, woman or man, religion, nationality, class or background, instead of seeing a person for who they truly are. So it's a form of prejudgment where individuals or groups are judged before they are truly known. In simple terms, prejudice is when we make up our minds about someone before actually knowing them. It's, I guess the best, maybe this will help us. It's like a dirty window, a window that hasn't been cleaned for years, okay? Imagine looking at the world through that dirty window that hasn't been cleaned. The dirt and grime distort everything you see. You can still make out shapes, but you miss the details, the colors. You miss the truth. Prejudice clouds our vision. It prevents us from being and seeing, it prevents us from actually seeing people clearly as they truly are. We end up reacting not to people, but to distorted reflections cast by our own prejudice. The Baha'i faith views the elimination of racial prejudice not just as a moral responsibility, but as a spiritual imperative, something essential if we wish to build a peaceful society, if we wish to really have a culture of peace. From its earliest days in the 19th century, the Baha'i teachings have emphasized that all people are one. Doesn't matter what their background, their characteristics, their differences, whatever. All people are one. This means recognizing that every human being, regardless of all those characterizations, race, gender, ethnicity, etc., is equally noble. Every individual is equally noble and deserves to be treated with dignity and, above all, a loving attitude. Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, called on all people to transcend the barriers that divide us. One of his most powerful exhortations is this: close your eyes to racial differences. Close your eyes to racial differences and welcome all with the light of oneness. His son Abdul Baha, who brought the teachings of the Baha'i faith to the Western Hemisphere, and in particular to America in the 20th century, spoke passionately and repeatedly about the need to eliminate all forms of racial prejudice. Isn't it interesting that here is a person from Iran who comes to America in the early 20th century, 1912, and speaks about eliminating racial prejudice? Now that's history making. In a talk given by Abdul Baha in New York in 1912, he states the following: God makes no distinction between white and black, inasmuch as all were created equal in the image of God. We must bring ourselves to realize that all embody divine possibilities. If you go into a garden and find all flowers alike in form, species, and color, the effect is wearisome on the eye. The garden is more beautiful, is more lovely when the flowers are many-colored and different. The variety lends charm and adornment. This calls for the elimination of racial prejudice. This call for the elimination of racial prejudice is not just poetic. It is deeply practical and vital. It challenges us to change the way we see each other, to shut our eyes not to reality, but to shut our eyes to the artificial divisions society imposes, and to open our hearts to the truth of our oneness and shared humanity. What we often overlook in that is that racial prejudice stands as one of the greatest barriers to peace. And this is something that the Baha'i Chair is extremely interested in. How is racial prejudice a barrier to a more peaceful society? I don't have to go into too much detail because you all have experience in the American society, and you know how this society will not find peace until there is racial justice. So, if indeed this is a barrier to peace, what we often fail to realize is the fact that where there is division, discrimination, and oppression of a particular group, or a hatred of a particular group, that it is impossible to have a healthy, happy society. It's impossible for such a society to flourish. And true unity and justice cannot take root in such a society. When a group of people is denied their individual rights and freedoms, a fair and just society is simply not possible. To build a just and peaceful world, we must uproot racism, in all its forms and replace it with the truth of our common humanity. In its place, we must cultivate friendship, compassion, understanding, and a spirit of unity. Racial prejudice remains one of the greatest obstacles to peace in this country and actually in the world. The Universal House of Justice powerfully describes racism as one of the most baneful and persistent evils, and a major barrier, as I said, to peace. Racism is a force that not only robs its victims of dignity and opportunity, but also corrupts those who perpetrate it and slows the progress of the entire society. So racism is not just a social problem, it is a moral crisis that degrades the human spirit and distorts our relationships. Overcoming it requires more than words. It demands the recognition that all of us as people are the same people. We are one common humanity. Only then can we unlock the potential for true peace and collective progress. Now, I want to just quote again from the Universal House of Justice, which, as you know, is the international council that is the head of the Baha'i religion. They wrote a letter after the George Floyd incident to the American Baha'i community, and in that letter they made this observation. Sadly, your nation's, meaning America's, history reveals that any significant progress towards racial equality is invariably met by opposition. In other words, every time there's progress, and there has been progress with racial equality in this country, but every time we move forward, there's this force that then takes it back. And they said this could be overt or covert. It may be right before our eyes, or it may be underground, this resistance to racial justice. And the House of Justice said, this process serves to undermine the advances achieved and to reconstitute the forces of oppression by other means. This is a very sobering observation, but it's a true observation. It's a painful truth that even as strides have been made towards racial justice, there have been often deliberate efforts, both visible and hidden, to roll back those gains and preserve a system of inequality. Now that we have examined the deep harm caused by racial prejudice and why it remains the most formidable barrier to a culture of peace, it's time to shift our focus to what can be done about it. What can we do in order to eliminate racial prejudice? What practical and meaningful steps can we take to eliminate this age-old disease of the human spirit? So in the next part of this talk, I'd like to explore some hopeful, practical, moral, and spiritual solutions for eliminating racial prejudice, beginning with how we think and act towards one another, how we raise our families, how we build community, and how our institutions must evolve. Because to eliminate racism is a very, very complex problem, and it requires every one of us to engage in that process. It is in this spirit that we now turn to the solutions rooted not in blame, not blaming, but in the moral courage to change hearts, to change minds, and to change structures. And I would say the family is perhaps the most important place where the elimination of racial prejudice can truly begin. It is in the home that our first ideas about the world and other people are formed. If families can succeed in raising children to respect and value all people by exposing them to different cultures, forming friendships across racial and ethnic lines, and teaching that every human being should be treated with love and dignity, then we are planting the seeds for a more just and peaceful world. When children grow up learning that all people are worthy of love, of fairness, of kindness, they carry those values with them to every corner of society. There's a powerful statement by Abdu'l-Baha which I'd like to share about this. He says, and please listen carefully to how he outlines this statement. A family is a nation in miniature. A family is a nation in miniature. Simply enlarge the circle of the household or the family, and you have the nation. Enlarge the circle of nations, and you have all humanity. The conditions surrounding the family surround the nation. The happenings in the family are the happenings in the life of the nations. Therefore, as strife and dissension destroy a family and prevent its progress, so nations are destroyed and advancement hindered. And I suggest you take that statement and think about our world today. How the nations are behaving and what is the role of the family. What this means is that the way we live and treat each other at home mirrors and shapes what happens in the wider society. If a family is torn by conflict and division, it can't thrive, and neither can nations or a global society that is built on the same patterns. But if a family learns to practice love, cooperation, justice, and unity, then those same qualities can ripple out into the community, into the nation, and beyond. This perspective, I believe, invites us to see the family not just as a private sphere, but as a starting point of real and lasting change. Building peace and eradicating racism is not only about laws or politics. That doesn't solve the problem. It helps, but it really doesn't solve it as we witness. It's about what we model in our homes, what we model to our children every day. When families embrace diversity and live out the values of equality and respect, they become powerful engines for healing and the transformation of the world. It is in the family that we can begin to shatter the chains of prejudice in order to pave the way to a culture of peace. At this point, and I'm getting to the end here, I would like to draw your attention to a very important area of research and findings that has emerged over the years. Extensive research on what is called altruism. altruism means the ability to act out of concern for others. So the ability for me, let's say, to act out of concern for others and for the benefit of others, even at a personal cost to me, even if it's risky for me. This is the definition of altruism, that all of us are willing to engage in activities, take steps that require courage and the ability to risk in order to assist another person. Research on altruism over literally, I would say 50 years of research now, highlights the crucial role families play in shaping individuals who reject prejudice and embrace empathy and humanity toward all people. Research on altruism and moral courage, particularly studies of those brave individuals who hid Jews during the Holocaust, those families who were Christian and took in Jews and hid them because they knew what would happen to them, that they would be killed eventually. They were willing to risk their life, knowing that if the Nazis discovered them, all of them, not only the Jews, but that family, would be all destroyed and shot to death. So this shows a very striking pattern that we as human beings are capable of altruism. We are capable of doing this great form of activity and action towards others. Individuals who took such extraordinary risks often, this research finds, so individuals who come from such extraordinary, who took such extraordinary risks often come from families where diversity and empathy were part of the daily life of that family. From an early age, they were exposed to people from different religions, from different cultures, from different backgrounds, including the Jews. Their families modeled spiritual values of love, of respect, of compassion, of moral responsibility, of reaching out to those different than them. This kind of upbringing in the family helped foster what scholars call moral extensivity, which is the ability to extend care and concern beyond one's immediate circle. The families who hid Jews in their homes or on their farms during the times of great danger risked their own lives to protect other lives. Their courage stands as a profound example of the power of the family to nurture selflessness, kindness, and deep concern for preserving and protecting human life, even when it's at a great risk to their own life. Phenomenal research. And we have examples after examples of individuals who do this. These individuals didn't view Jews as the other. But as fellow human beings, worthy of dignity and protection. Their willingness to act courageously didn't arise out of nowhere. It was nurtured in homes that emphasized empathy, inclusion, and a deep recognition of the inherent dignity and worth of every human being, the worth of every human life. building on the research just explored about the role of the family in raising children who eventually are willing to show courage and even kindness and risk their lives to protect others, it is noteworthy that in the 1930s, Shoghi Effendi, who is one of the leaders of the Baha'i faith, wrote to the American Baha'i community and stressed to the American Baha'i community that you have a major responsibility when it comes to removing racial prejudice from the midst of your country. He wrote, "As to racial prejudice, the corrosion of which for over a century has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole social structure of American society." By the way, he wrote this in the 1930s, when I said the culture of peace is going to be hard to achieve unless we get rid of racial prejudice. So he says, you know, racial prejudice, that horrible thing, evil, that is destroying the American society, that you need to consider this as the most vital and challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community at its present stage in its evolution. So I bring this up because this is something, this issue of creating and bringing about racial justice is something that Baha'is have a deep responsibility for. It's a part of their spiritual mandate, if you will. And Shoghi Effendi says to eliminate racial prejudice will require sacrifice, will require care, it will require vigilance, moral courage, fortitude, tact, sympathy, all of those. And it reminds me of altruism and those individuals who were willing, and still some who are willing, to risk their lives, to do whatever it takes to ensure that others are okay. I think this passage reminds us that eradicating racial prejudice is not an option. It's not a choice. It's a spiritual and social imperative that demands everything from us. Above all, I would say love. Love for people who we do not come into contact with, usually. It requires more than good intentions. It takes clear, purposeful actions and principles that change how we think and behave. And here I'd like to just give you a few examples of how we can begin to look at ways of making a change happen in our own lives in relation to eradicating racial prejudice. First is education without bias, that honest and accurate knowledge. Please, what we are fed often out in society, what is considered popular, is not the way to go. It requires deeper understanding, looking at all the better options that are out there to educate ourselves, to free ourselves from stereotypes. And it involves not only teaching children, but also us adults need to keep re-educating ourselves. The other one is modeling respect. I think the example I gave about altruism and how those families raised children who became these heroes, I think that's a very good example of modeling respect. If parents model respect, children will model respect. The other area is equality and justice. These are the foundations of a fair society, guaranteed. Where you don't have fairness and equality and justice in a society, you will not have peace. And then consultation, consultation. This is extremely important, to have open and honest, but at the same time respectful conversations where everyone listens and shares ideas and perspectives. Community groups that bring people of different races and backgrounds together to discuss candidly and openly common problems, build understanding and trust that break down walls of suspicion and prejudice. Just a few more. Unity and diversity, recognizing that our differences actually enrich us. They are not obstacles, but strengths that contribute to a more vibrant, creative, united society. And finally, service as a way of life. I think service, doing something for others, is the most healthy psychological thing one can do. Psychologists will tell you this, I think. Whether it's volunteering at a food drive or whatever, mentoring young persons or working on community projects, acts of service bring people of different backgrounds together in meaningful ways. Serving side by side creates bonds of trust, friendship. It nurtures understanding. It helps us to see one another as equals. And it also gets us out of the house and gets us out into society so we can see what are the issues. How do I create a culture of peace? So now to the conclusion, and I hope I'm within time. Eliminating racial prejudice or any form of prejudice may seem like an overwhelming, even impossible goal. Yet history has shown time and again that when people unite around a moral and spiritual principle, they can achieve what once seemed absolutely unachievable. Just to give you a couple of examples before I conclude. The system of racial oppression that once we thought was immovable, the apartheid system in South Africa, it was violent, it was horrible, it suppressed, it oppressed a whole population, and yet, over time, this system was torn down. It was totally diminished. Or, I would say, the women's suffrage movement. Imagine there was a time women couldn't vote. And yet, and women, they were in a struggle. It was violent at times, it was very hard, but over time, women got the vote. But I would like to share a more contemporary example that illustrates the truth of what it takes to eliminate prejudice and how do you respond to prejudice and oppression. And what I'd like to do is turn to the experience of the Iranian Baha'i community. The Baha'i community, particularly in places like Iran, offers a very powerful example of how families can respond to persecution and prejudice, not with hatred and despair, but with what the Universal House of Justice has called constructive resilience. In the face of severe injustice, unimaginable hardship, horrible life, violence, imprisonment, being denied higher education, being denied their very basic rights, Baha'i families have focused on nurturing moral integrity, providing community-based education to poor children, to poor families, and contributing to the betterment of the Iranian society. They go to prison for it. Especially the youth. Especially the youth. This approach teaches that even under the most difficult of circumstances, even under oppression, the family can be a fortress of light, raising children who are not bitter, but brave and loving, not vengeful, but visionary. How can I help my country become a better place? That's what these youth in Iran are trying to do, and the families in Iran. From a Baha'i perspective, eliminating racial prejudice does not simply mean fighting racism. Rather, it requires building a community and society rooted in principles of equality and inclusion. We must work hard to create a way of life in which all people, regardless of background, are embraced with warmth, fellowship, love, and unity, an environment where racism has no soil in which to grow, an environment which ultimately will create a culture of peace. This is the great task before us, not merely to oppose injustice, but to build a new pattern of life rooted in unity, compassion, and the recognition of our shared humanity. It begins in our families, in our communities, and in the quiet choices we make every day to treat one another with respect and love. When we commit to nurturing a world where prejudice cannot take root, we become builders and champions of peace, not just for today, but for generations to come. Let us walk forward with courage, guided by the vision of a world where no one is seen as other or as a stranger, and every soul is welcomed as a member of one human family. Dear friends, to build peace, we must go to its roots. We cannot legislate love. We cannot order justice from the top down. We must promote it and support it from within ourselves, starting in our hearts, within the heart of the family. Baha'u'llah's vision for a united world is not a utopian fantasy. It is a process that has already begun and taking shape. It invites everyone to join them, whether they are a member of the community or not, it doesn't matter. Those are artificial boundaries. But it will only be fulfilled when the chains of all forms of prejudice are finally broken. And every individual and family has a role to play. Thank you so much. Thank you.